It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello there, David.
Hello, everybody.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello.
We've got a great show today. In the first portion of today's program, we'll be joined by climate reporter Stephen Mufson. His article in the Washington Post examines some recent corporate commitments to become carbon neutral in the next 20 years. Public pressure about the climate crisis has finally pushed companies like Amazon and FedEx to take some sort of action to reduce emissions. But how will these climate-conscious policies mesh with the corporate culture of shareholder supremacy? Well, we'll find out. Then many of the structures that previous generations could rely on, from a community supporting its local businesses to Social Security and pension funds waiting for you to cash out at an old age, have largely left millennials and Gen Zers hanging high and dry. In place of reliable institutions or stable jobs, we've seen the rise of the gig economy and the uncertain present and the even more uncertain future that accompany it. Sure, it can be freeing to have choices of what you do and what you become, but as Pete Davis explores in his book Dedicated, how can we improve our relationships, our communities, our world, if we don't commit to them? He'll be our second guest today. We'll talk to him about how, in a society that fetishizes keeping your options open, making a commitment can be an act of rebellion. Then, if we have time, Ralph will answer some of your listener questions. And as always, we'll get the latest in corporate crime from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, can the market save the planet? David?
Stephen Mufson is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who reports on the business of climate change for the Washington Post. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Stephen Mufson.
Glad to be here.
Welcome indeed, Steve. Your article is titled, Can the Market Save the Planet? FedEx is the latest brand name firm to say it's trying. More than 50 companies have vowed to be carbon neutral by 2040. That is a real tall order. It's 19 years from now. And we've had a lot of corporate pledges in all kinds of areas and promises. Banks pledged to put billions of dollars in low-income areas, for example. And there's rarely a follow-up. There's rarely a way to measure the progress between the present day and when they expect their promise to be fulfilled. What did FedEx tell you about that?
Well, I think FedEx, there are some things you can see by numbers in FedEx. They are talking about electrifying their fleet of more than 180,000 vehicles. So that's something you'd be able to see relatively clearly. It's not as obscure as for some companies. Also, an important part of this whole exercise would have to be a much greater degree of transparency than companies have now. The Biden administration, I think, is going to try to get the Securities Exchange Commission to require that companies reveal more about their greenhouse gas emissions. In FedEx's case, they're already doing that. So you can look back and say, okay, FedEx made a commitment about its air fleet a few years ago, but in fact, they didn't get there. And you can see that with FedEx's own statistics on emissions. So of course, ideally you'd like people to be transparent and to actually succeed in hitting those targets. But I think that gives you a little bit of a sense of where people are trying to go or talking about going.
Well, there are other groups other than the SEC that can push these companies for periodic updates and reporting. For example, shareholder responsibility groups could do that. Environmental groups could supervise and demand disclosure that way. You mentioned a lot of other companies that have made similar promises. IBM, Microsoft, Unilever, Johnson Controls, Coca-Cola, Uber, Best Buy. You have mentioned one company, Acciona, a Spanish energy and infrastructure company that already went carbon neutral in 2016. And for those of you in the audience who don't know what carbon neutrality is, I'm quoting from Steve's article. It means, quote, companies must rely entirely on renewable fuels or offset the burning of fossil fuels with the capture and storage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, end quote. Of course, renewable fuel displacement is understandable. What is puzzling to a lot of people is this carbon recapture. Can you talk about that?
Sure. It's a technique for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then storing it. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. And people have a lot of different feelings about this whole process. Oil companies are very interested in this because they think that will enable them to continue to sell oil and gas and that they somehow be able to recapture it from the air or from other kind of flue streams. So some of the bigger chunks of money are going at this technique, and you can use the carbon dioxide if you're an oil company to enhance recovery from wells and to get more oil out of them. So obviously this isn't really a kind of long-term solution, and I think a lot of other companies are looking at it in different contexts, but that's what's happening there now. And it's being assisted. All these programs are being helped in the United States by a piece of legislation which gives tax credits for companies that can successfully capture and store carbon dioxide from the air.
Well, carbon capture, as you know, has been an elusive phenomenon. I mean, there are a lot of false starts. I remember talking with a Princeton professor 10 years ago. He was telling me he's working on carbon capture with government grants, and that was 10 years ago. Now, Fred Smith, the head of FedEx, has just given his alma mater, Yale, $100 million for a new Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture.
Yeah.
And does this involve offsets? In other words, could FedEx say, well, we're going to reduce our net carbon contribution to the atmosphere by expanding a forest and planting a lot of trees? Or is there a more technological fix here envisioned in this grant to Yale?
I think that the grant to Yale is multifaceted. Most of it's about natural storage, which means basically more trees or better tilling techniques and that sort of things. And FedEx could use that, I suppose, to offset things like jet fuel. It's a little hard. There are certain economic activities that are harder to get to zero out the greenhouse gases for. So jet fuel is one of those. So I think that's one reason why FedEx is interested.
Mm-hmm.
Doing this through offsets is always a bit tricky because measuring them is tricky. Preventing a certain amount of corruption is tricky. So I think in the environmental movement, there's a lot of emphasis on companies zeroing out their own emissions and not using offsets to do otherwise.
Which leads to my next question. This is the most obvious one. When people say, who are supporting building new nuclear plants or doing investment in carbon storage, the obvious question is, why don't you take that kind of money and put it in energy efficiency and solar energy? In other words, as long as you're going to spend all this money on carbon storage, which is a long delayed process and a lot of unknowns, but we know how to make the use of energy efficient. And as they say, a megawatt of electricity saved is a megawatt of electricity you don't have to produce. What about that approach?
I think it's hard to argue with that. I mean, the energy conservation's always better. No question about that. And, I think that carbon capture faces a lot of obstacles. One of them is that it's an energy intensive process. In order to suck the carbon dioxide out of the air requires heating up certain parts of the process. So, it's not a great solution. And energy efficiency would be much better.
The other aspect of all this is, there are some mid-sized companies, Steve, that have already done this. I mean, Interface Corporation in Atlanta, which is the largest carpet tile manufacturer in the country. They have factories all over the world based in Atlanta, and they started over 20 years ago the company drive to be carbon neutral. And they announced in 2019 they've reached the goal. And now they're going for carbon negative by 2040. In other words, that means that they give back to the earth more than they take out of it. So they're already carbon neutral. And it was an excruciating process. The great CEO, Ray Anderson, who passed away in 2011, he was like an engineering efficiency professor. Every little item, everything, the supplies, the transportation, the factories, had to be redesigned. Why is it that companies like Interface and Patagonia in California, which is far more advanced than most other companies in terms of moving toward carbon neutrality, why don't they get more coverage? Because they meet the bottom line, they make profit, they're successful companies, and you would think those would be more publicized yardsticks for some of the larger companies that you mentioned in your article.
Well, it's not the only article we've run on this subject. I did another story recently about the need to mobilize and channel private capital into projects that would reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. Of course, the government should be doing that, but it often lacks the will and it often lacks the means to do as much as the private sector can, if the private sector can be mobilized. And so, we see some of that in a month like this, April, which is when most companies have their big annual meetings. So there's a lot of pressure, or a lot compared to the past anyway, on companies to do something. But my feeling about this is the way my feeling is about a lot of aspects of climate change. And that is that there are a ton of really interesting things happening, from carpet makers to battery makers. But what's missing is speed and scale. These things aren't happening fast enough, and they aren't happening on a large enough dimension to prevent us from hitting catastrophic climate change in another 10 or 20 or 30 years. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I think that there are a ton of interesting things happening, and the trick is to try to get more of them, more of them going.
Extending what you just said, there are two other areas worthy of exploration. One is to have public yardsticks year by year, just the way you have economic yardsticks, GDP yardsticks. And the government, the government is really the institution that should be doing more of that, because that really keeps the dynamic moving. And the other thing is sort of its twin, which is, and I'll ask the question in terms of FedEx. When FedEx announced this, did United Parcel make any reaction? Did the post office make any reaction? They have hundreds of thousands of trucks too.
Yeah, and I've spoken to someone who's trying to get the Postal Service trucks changed over. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of hope at the Postal Service, because the president has said that the entire government fleet will be switched to electric vehicles. And I think that the Postal Service is hoping either to be included in that or to be added to that.
And how about United Parcel, which is a big competitor with FedEx?
Yeah, I don't know what United Parcel's position is.
Well, many years ago, actually 1964, I went down to the General Services Administration. We were trying to get auto safety legislation in Congress. And I said, you buy 40,000 cars a year for federal employees. Why don't you require seatbelts? Why don't you require some of these safety standards? You're a big buyer, customer's always right. And they actually did it. And it helped get the bill through Congress. Is the GSA rising to the occasion? I mean, you alluded to what the Biden administration is talking about. Now they have far more than 40,000 vehicles purchased every year. Are they making any noises?
Well, this is one of those areas where I believe the president has executive authority. And it's only been 100 days for Biden, but he seems determined to do something about that. So again, the question will be, how fast can we get those vehicles made and onto the streets? Because it does require some changes in, the auto lines and stuff like that. So I'm just not sure how fast they can go, but I think the president seems to have a tremendous sense of urgency. So we'll see how that translates.
Yeah, and the thing is to strike at the continuum where prevention, technological prevention, more efficient vehicles, more efficient heating, more efficient lighting, rather than at the other end of the energy cycle, trying to pick up the pieces by carbon recapture. I think in your article, you quoted a former chief economist for the Council of Economic Advisors under Obama. His name's Michael Greenstone. He teaches at the University of Chicago. And he said, quote, "You see some real live investment in carbon removal, but we're in the top of the first inning on carbon removal. So we don't know what that's going to deliver yet," unquote. That's not very reassuring compared to the acceleration of energy conservation and new technology that can reduce the amount of energy used per unit of work, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, well, I'm not in the business of reassurance. So I think that, one of the big questions on the climate change issue is whether we already have the technology to solve this problem or whether we are still waiting for some sort of breakthrough technology.
Mm-hmm.
If you're Bill Gates, you're betting on the breakthrough, and he has devoted a lot of money to that area. Other people will say, look, we've got this technology now. It's just a question of applying it on a massive scale. And I think that's, one of the struggles going on below the surface in the environment, in the environment and climate action front.
One variable, Steve, we're talking with Steve Mufson of the Washington Post. Whenever you see his byline, you know it's an important article. It's not fluff. But one variable that pops up here, Steve, is leadership. Interface basically did what it did because of the leadership of Ray Anderson, the CEO. Patagonia is doing what it's doing because of Yvon Chouinard, the CEO and founder of that company. And when companies aren't doing it, you just don't see that kind of leadership. Even in the article that you wrote, if you look at the leadership of the Post Office and United Parcel and FedEx, the one that pops up most frequently in terms of assertiveness is Fred Smith, who did his Yale senior thesis on logistics of air transporting products and turned it into FedEx. Quite a story, as you know. What do you think of the leadership theory here in terms of inciting competition? In other words, does a leader like, say, Fred Smith affect the leaders of the other companies that are in the same field to move? Have you ever found out anything about that?
Well, I think that's true, that leadership does make a huge difference. We have done surveys on people's feelings about climate change, for example. And even among Republicans, I think that about 60% of them believe that climate change is real and that people are contributing to it. So that number has, been inching upward over the last decade or so. But inching is the operative word. I think that Fred Smith is one of a growing number of chief executives who understands this issue. But again, it's, speed is essential. And there are a lot of CEOs out there who I still think either think that this isn't going to affect them or that it's inevitable and that it's something that they don't need to pay attention to. So I think there are still a lot of CEOs out there like that, and fewer and fewer every week, I feel. But it's a question of getting to where we need to go by the time we need to get there.
Well, your point on speed and scale obviously is well taken. The thing that scares executives of corporations is unanticipated costs. And with tornadoes and floods and wildfires and
Yeah.
droughts and hurricanes,
Yeah.
they're getting unanticipated costs, which brings in a key factor, the insurance industry. Tell
Yeah.
us, the insurance industry is pretty upset about this from Swiss Re, the
Yeah.
reinsurer. Tell us about that as a goad to these companies.
Absolutely. I mean, the insurance business has one of the first ones hit because climate change contributes to flooding, more frequent flooding, hurricanes, and wildfires. So the insurance industry is making it much tougher for you to get insurance for your beach house, say, in a place that's vulnerable. I wanted to also mention that utility companies are also in the forefront here. That's partly because a lot of states set regulatory standards for the utilities to switch to green the grid, basically, to have more renewable energy. And the utilities didn't need too much persuading because they get a return on their investment no matter what they're investing in. So they're happy to invest in a wind and solar plant just as much as a coal plant. So I think, in those two areas, we're seeing a lot of movement and a lot of change.
Well,
So, when you get to the oil and gas sector, it's a little tougher going.
Well, this is where the President of the United States comes in as a catalyst, as a mover and shaker, and synthesizer, pushing all these pieces together that we've been discussing. Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you for giving us the time. We've been talking with Steve Mufson of the Washington Post. Readers and listeners may want to follow his articles because they're really right on top of the issues of the day. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Stephen Mufson. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we're going to talk about the counterculture of commitment. If you want to find out what that means, stay tuned. Right now, let's take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, May 21, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. An additive used in Skittles, Starburst, Hostess donuts, and thousands of other foods should no longer be considered safe for human consumption. That's according to a new study from the European Union's top food safety agency. A scientific panel created by the European Food Safety Authority found that titanium dioxide can no longer be considered as safe when used as a food additive. The panel, citing concerns about titanium dioxide's genotoxicity, or its ability to damage DNA, based its conclusion on a review of hundreds of scientific studies. The Environmental Working Group in the United States called on the Food and Drug Administration to quickly consider whether to ban titanium dioxide from use in food. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. A few nights ago, my wife and I were scrolling through Netflix, trying to find a movie to watch after dinner, and it's 2 days later, and we still haven't picked one. We live in a world with so many choices, where it seems like we can surf and browse forever without ever settling on anything. Our next guest is going to make the case for commitment. David?
Pete Davis is a civic advocate, co-founder of the Democracy Policy Network, and the author of Dedicated, The Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Pete Davis.
So glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pete. I think I should tell our listeners that you worked with us for a couple of years before you went to Harvard Law School, and you also put out a report at Harvard Law School on its bicentennial, talking about the law school's failure to encourage its graduates to go into public interest law and leaving the option being corporate law. And I helped you on that project. So listeners, you should know that I am very sympathetic to what Pete Davis has been doing as a public advocate. And now we have his first book, which is not easy to summarize. When I'm looking at the contents, I notice that he analyzes habits that are very prevalent among the young generation, but not only the young generation. Infinite browsing mode, he calls it. And then he moves into the counterculture of commitment. And then he talks about people who are committed, citizens, patriots, builders, stewards, artisans, companions. Pete, I thought the chapter on long haul heroism was a real grabber. And it was the scene at the Boston Music Hall on New Year's 1863 at midnight when the Emancipation Proclamation would take effect. And the poets Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Ralph Waldo Emerson helped organize the event. The famous author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, was in the gallery. William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist newspaperman, was also in the gallery. And you describe it in such a compelling way, it almost makes you feel like you're there, as an example of long-term commitment. Years and years, decades and decades, abolitionist advocacy, and all the suffering and pain that went along with it, culminated in this Emancipation Proclamation, which, as you know, did have its limitations. So let's ask you, as the author, to tell us what this book is all about.
Yeah, I'm so glad you talked about that. Is my favorite part of the book as well, Ralph, because I wanted to show people, and this is kind of the political angle on the book. I wanted to show people that politics is neither fast nor impossible. You know, there's a lot of people that think you do one big event, you join the big march in the streets, or you do this one electoral campaign, and then you find out that, you know, you didn't change much, you didn't reach the promised land. And then you find yourself in the second group of people, which is you become a cynic who believes that nothing ever changes. And what I wanted to show with this book is that things do change, but they require long haul commitment. Sometimes they take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years to fight for. And the reason that I wanted to tell that story of the abolitionists was I wanted to show a party and a celebration at the culmination of a long haul. But then I wanted to flash back that, you know, Longfellow started his fight 20 years before when he published poems on slavery. Emerson started his fight 2 decades before when he started The Atlantic. You know, William Lloyd Garrison started the Liberator newspaper 32 years before. Frederick Douglass, 24 years before that, escaped from slavery.
And Frederick Douglass was there and described the scene in the Boston Music Hall as a, quote, wild and grand scene. People threw hats and bonnets in the air. Old nemesis from intra-movement divides hugged. And Douglas's friend began singing his favorite hymn, and the crowd joined him.
Yes. And I wanted, you know, often when we talk about politics, it's always doom and gloom. But I want to say that with the right commitment, with the right strategy, with everyone bringing their skills to bear on something, similar long hoped for triumphs await us too. It's very possible for a young listener listening to this that if you started now, that in a few decades, we might see the last fossil fuel extracted from the ground. We might see the day when they announce that a majority of firms are cooperative firms instead of corporate firms. We might see the day where the Congress is from all different walks of life and not disproportionately one group than another and fighting for it. We might see the day where Medicare for all is passed. And it's going to be because of long hauls that are emerging now or emerged a while back and you joined up with and campaigned for. And so the message is a call to action to become a long haul hero yourself. It's a very actionable book. And it's a call to arms against the often stated argument that a lot of young people get from their elders, which is that the highest thing you can do is keep your options open, that don't commit to anything, don't commit to a cause or a place or a person or an institution, because that'll tie you down. But when you look at the people who earn the most respect, for me, it was you, Ralph. You know, when I looked at heroes like you and others in your movement, like Lori Wallach and others, it's the ones that decided to commit to a particular cause. It's the ones who decided to commit to a particular place, not the ones who said, you know, I'm going to go get a job or flitter around that will allow me to keep my options open in the most maximal way. And it's not just about impact, it's also about joy, that there's a lot of happiness that comes when you commit to things as well.
Well, you make that very clear, but you know, you do alert the readers to this browsing culture in some detail and how damaging it can be and short-lived in terms of its gratification. Is commitment the only way out? Why don't you describe, you really are very graphic in the way you describe people who are stuck in this mode of browsing around and keeping all options open, and we would call it in the old days drifting.
Drift versus mastery, I guess, is the famous Walter Lippmann book. Yet there are pleasures. I want to, you know, I start the book with giving browsing its due. And I think this is why people browse. You know, one is the pleasure of flexibility. Everything becomes a lot more light, a lot less serious, a lot more, as in the words of young people, chill. Second is it leads to a lot of novelty. You know, you get to experience all these exciting new things. You get to flitter through all these interesting videos or interesting ideas or opinions. And, you know, on a deepest level, it sometimes browsing allows you to throw off the chains of inauthenticity and find your authentic self. But all of those pleasures are haunted by pains. With flexibility, jumping from thing to thing, comes choice paralysis. You suddenly think it's scary to pick anything because you've seen all the other 100 things you could do, all the other causes you could work on, all the other places you could be, institutions you could be with. Also, that novelty comes with shallowness. You've flitted through 100 videos, but you haven't learned anything. You read 1,000 tweets, but you might as well have spent that time reading a book, because you're going to remember that book years later and you're not going to remember any of those tweets. And authenticity is very important, finding your authentic self. But if your authenticity is about never subsuming yourself in something bigger than yourself, never dealing with the messiness of working with other people or being part of a larger thing that might not fit you perfectly, you might end up with what the philosopher Emile Durkheim and sociologist called anomie, the feeling of total spiritual isolation, that there's no meaning in your life at all, because it's not just the pain of losing a game, it's the pain of having no scoreboard. It's not just the pain of being lost on the journey, but there being no map or journey at all. And if we can overcome the fears of regret, of missing out, of associating with other people, the messiness of associating with other people, we can find the freedom of purpose that comes with commitment, the joy of community that comes with the commitment, the power of depth and expertise and experiential knowledge that comes with commitment. And this book is trying to nudge people past those fears, seeing those pains that come with the pleasures of browsing, so that they can get those joys and, importantly, impact that comes with committing to something for the long haul.
Well, the anomie point is nothing new about that. It's elaborating in virtual reality and the internet, but it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, especially in novels. Russian novels and other novels point out the young generation feeling meaningless. And I thought that knowing a little bit more history, Pete, might reduce that kind of sense of meaningless, sense that nothing can ever change, that the big boys will always run the show. Look at the tobacco history. When I went to Washington, the tobacco industry was considered invincible, that the members from Virginia and North Carolina and other tobacco areas just had a lock, and the tobacco companies could induce youngsters outside elementary schools to pick up smoking by giving them free tobacco. They dominated the advertising airwaves, and a few people started saying, no, this is the biggest killer coming out of the corporations, 430,000 lives a year. We're going to change it. Now, those very young people that you're addressing in this book, Dedicated, The Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing, would be absolutely stunned if they walked on an airplane or walked into a hospital waiting room or even went to their workplace and people were smoking cigarettes, because they're not allowed to anymore. I remember at Princeton, I'd walk into my lecture hall and there's sometimes I could hardly see the students. There was so much smoking going on. If the very people who are engaged now in infinite browsing would realize how many of the things they take for granted that they like in this country started out with a few people who said, no, we're not going to have a flitting, short attention span life. We're going to have a life of commitment, and we're going to choose the course of justice that our temperament and our priorities lead us to. So I think a little more history might even strengthen your argument.
I interviewed 50 long haul heroes from all different types of things, things that we like to talk about, like causes, but also people who committed to reviving communities or being honorable in their profession, or even just mentors and teachers and pastors. And almost all of them mentioned that exact point, Ralph, which was they studied history. I interviewed, and that, the history of, they studied their own family history. If it was like an interpersonal thing, they studied their local history to gain strength, or they studied the history of causes. I interviewed, one of my favorite interviews was with Evan Wolfson, who is the leading lawyer that helped secure the recognition of gay marriage in America. It was a 32-year battle. He wrote about a constitutional right to same-sex marriage in his 3L law school paper, and he walked that fight, along with many others, from the lowest form of legal writing, a 3L paper, to the highest form of legal writing, a Supreme Court decision 32 years later. And I asked him, how did you stick with it? It was only fun in the last 5 years when you started really getting victories. How did you deal with your time in the desert when everyone was against you? And he literally said that. I studied history, Lincoln, Gandhi, King, the women's suffrage movement, even ancient history, and reading about those past struggles gave him great consolation and helped him get through it. And I'm very inspired by people have asked me, what are some action items that leaders can take to lead to a more dedicated people? And one of the examples, it seems like a soft thing, but I am very inspired by the Dig Where You Stand movement, which was this movement of popular history that came out of Sweden, which started in the union fight to have you research the history of your company, but then has expanded to all types of local history and saying we need to make local history and institutional history and cause history and profession history alive in young people today, so they know that things take time, but they do change. And that everything we cherish today, like you said, Ralph, has come from a long haul fight from the past.
And it seems quite obvious, that if people don't know history, they don't have a mooring in their culture. I ask people, how much would you know about yourself if all you knew was the last 6 months of your place on earth here? It's so obvious. Now, you went to Harvard Law School, as I did, and you were considered an agitator, a respected agitator. You gave one of the commencement speeches on the counterculture of commitment. And this book is an outgrowth of that. Can you describe to our listeners what life was like at Harvard Law School? Do the students reflect your description of the age of infinite browsing, or they were singular-minded? They knew exactly where they wanted to go to practice?
Well, it was funny, when you talk to people who end up going into corporate interest law instead of public interest law. And this was the big fight at the law school because 80% of people come in saying, 70 to 80 come in saying, in surveys, I am going to law school because I want to fight for justice or fight for the public interest or support my community. And 70 to 80% end up leaving, fighting for the most powerful and wealthy forces in the country, and usually not in their home community, but in New York or DC or LA or the like. And when you ask them, you would assume it's all about the money, but part of it's about the money, part of it's about debt, part of it's about, where you're being encouraged through status. But a huge part of it was everyone said to themselves, well, I want to keep my options open for future jobs, and I still care about justice, but this is a good start that will allow me to go into anything else later. And what you find out in the survey data about where they go into, they don't end up usually going into public interest or justice fights later. That keeping your options open is a mode of life that kind of becomes inertia and you eventually never commit if you lean too far into that. And I see exactly what we're talking about there in the culture of the law school, where the law school exists outside of time. You don't have a sense of history of the law and all the fights that went into the fight for equal justice under law or the rule of law. You don't have a sense of the future, which is not just, you talk about history, that's memory. The future is prophecy, which sounds like this grand word, but it's really about vision for the future. What are alternative ways the law could be structured? What are fights that we're fighting for to change things? You never talk about the future, and you don't even talk really about the present. You bring this up all the time, Ralph. You don't learn about the empirical reality of what's actually going on, the total evils that are perpetuated, the total abdications of the mission of, the rule of law and equal justice under law, the total corruption of the institutions like the prison system, the criminal legal system, the civil legal system. And thus you're kind of floating in the air, never given the elements that attach you to something, that make you become an honorable profession.
The amazing thing about it is that the law professors are the best and the brightest. If you didn't believe that, all you had to do was ask them. And they had a curriculum that asked the question how, rather than ask the question why. How does this monstrous Internal Revenue Code work so you can negotiate it on behalf of your lucrative client? Instead of why did this monster come about and be so inequitable and so needlessly complex.
Amen to that. They never ask these questions of mission. I talk about the difference between a professional school and a careerism school. If you think about careerism, that is all about giving you as an individual tools for your own personal advancement, going inner and inner, higher status and higher status, bigger and bigger, richer and richer. A profession is a community of competence. And professionalism is not, stuffiness, wearing a suit, talking in proper terms. That's like the surface level of professionalism. The deeper sense of professionalism is the idea that a profession has a mission, and that mission should be alive in the daily life of the profession, at the conferences, at the, the ways people in the profession talk to you, and at the most vibrant in the professional schools. And yet the mission of the law, for example, the mission of the law, I believe, is protect the rule of law and fight for equal justice under law. It's kind of this dual mission. Was never present in the schools. We talked a lot about rules and ethics, cold, neutral rules and ethics. Don't steal money from your clients. Don't lie. But we never talked about the deeper moral and mission questions of what are we even doing here? What is the purpose of a criminal legal system? What is the purpose of a civil legal system? Are we living up to this mission as a profession right now? Is the school living up to its mission as being a watchdog of the profession? And you need the professors and the deans of these professional schools to make that mission alive in the school. And in my experience, they were abdicating it while I was there.
And it's more than just the commercialization of law schools, which relate to how much fair play they're going to be in everyday people's lives, but they create myths. People go through law school and they think that the law of contract means a voluntary meeting of the minds between, say, the consumer and the vendor. Or if you're wrongfully injured, you can get a trial by jury in a court of law. And they're not taught how these two private pillars of law in America are being destroyed by corporate power. Look at all the fine print contracts. Are you really voluntarily entering into agreement with Facebook or your credit card company or your large landlord? No, it's all pre-printed, standard form, take it or leave it. And so they're actually producing myths, which is the worst kind of education, because what happens is that these students have no sense of inequitable systems of power, and they gravitate to the most powerful law firms without thinking through how they want to spend 50, 60 years of their professional lives.
Amen. And this book, it has some of that message of the desert that we're in culturally in many of the professions, but it's also a very hopeful book about how we can turn it around and the almost miraculous experiences you will discover if you just commit to something for a bit. So I tell the story of these 20, 30-year walks, but even reaching year 5 of a commitment, amazing things happen. In our example of the law, Lena Khan, she's my age. She was, she's in her very early 30s. In 2016, when she was 26, I think 26 years old, she started working on an essay called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, which was the first major law review article on the case for, breaking up Amazon and doing antitrust enforcement against it. Back when, when Amazon wasn't the big boogeyman yet that it is in the headlines today. She wrote that, did all this deep dive, long haul work of writing this very coherent, popular law review article. And then she agitated around the article after she published it. And 5 years later, she's been invited into the administration to help affect the administration's antitrust policy. And, Amazon, she's one of kind of enemy number one because they're so scared of how effective and impactful she's going to be.
All right, let's get to your view of dedication. On page 49 of your book, you define it. You say, quote, dedication requires the cultivation of what could be called the dedicatory virtues. It requires imagination, that is, the ability to envision what isn't there just yet. It requires synthesis, that is, the ability to make connections. It requires focus, the ability to concentrate, and doggedness, so you can return to the same task again and again, even if there's nothing new about it. Our key, so is passion, the enthusiasm required to sustain engagement. And there can be no passion without reverence, the ability to be awed by something. Above all, dedication requires commitment, the ability to stick with something despite there being other available options, end quote. I might add, Pete, those are the traits that make for a great sports player and a great artist. They spend years and years honing their skills with passion and all the virtues of dedication. All right, now with that background, tell us about your chapter, Open Options, Morality, Indifference versus Honor.
Yeah, so, in the beginning of the book, I talk about a lot of this in terms of individual psychology. What are the personal fears, the fear of regret or missing out or associating with other people that come with commitment, the pleasures and pains of browsing versus dedication on an individual level. But in the end, I talk about three ways on a bigger level, cultural, political, institutional, that affect our ability to make commitments. And so one of those, I talk about economics, how our economy forces you out of jobs and throws you in every which way, or our education system we've talked a bit about, but morality is one of those three I talk about, which is the dominant morality of our time is you don't bother me, I don't bother you, we're all just doing our own individual ends. You shouldn't judge other people and other people shouldn't judge you. And the highest level you can be in this morality is, you follow the ground rules and you don't bother other people. And so that sounds good to many young people our age. And it sounds good to me too on some levels. We don't want people to be nosy. We don't want people to be hypocritically casting stones. We definitely don't want the old judgments of patriarchy and white supremacy and homophobia of that, oppressed and belittled so many people. But a world where you have no morality, no judgment, is a world where people get away with things. And I try to point to examples of good forms of judgment. The forms of, Ralph, when you say this corporation is acting immorally, or this institution is not living up to its mission, it's become corrupted. Or this warmonger is trying to whitewash his legacy and re-enter polite society without anyone calling him out and saying, you just spent 20 years doing horrible things. Why are we welcoming you to the party still without any atonement? Judgment is what keeps communities going. And that's when I talk about moving from a culture of indifference to a culture of honor. A culture of honor is I talked about it in terms of negative terms, but a culture of honor is also a culture where we celebrate people who live up to a mission. We say we celebrate people who have virtues like honesty and fidelity and courage and awareness. When someone does a heroic act, we give them awards. And I know that's something you're very big on, Ralph, that when you give annual awards, it's not really about celebrating that one person. It's mostly about telling everyone else in the audience, these qualities are worth celebrating. An honor culture is a world where missions are talked about and people who are going wayward on them are called out. And the two types of figures I talk about who really promote a culture of honor are, one is mentors, elders who are more experienced in something, telling young people, here is not just tools for you to do whatever you want, but here are some worthy attachments. Here are some worthy commitments. And the other one I talk about is prophets, which we talk about usually in this grand biblical predicting the future sense. But a prophet in the deepest sense of the word is someone who calls a community back to its mission, who is the conscience of a community. And in a world without prophets, institutions get corrupted, people get away with things that are wrong, harms and injustices are perpetuated. And in a world with many more prophets, people being the stick in the mud and saying, this is wrong, this is not right, we should judge this, are the people that kind of bring us back to what the type of community that we want.
Now, one point you made that's very few authors make. It's on page 237, future readers of this book. And it calls the culture of commitment, the counterculture of commitment, is also the most capable of solving our collective challenges. One of the biggest barriers to tackling the great challenges of our time is the lack of people seriously dedicated to tackling them. We have too many one-off dragon slayers and not enough long-haul heroes ready to spend 10, 20, or 30 years reviving places, institutions, communities, crafts, and causes. there aren't enough people who are not just willing to die for something, but are willing to live for it, end quote. And if they don't have a lucky choice of parents the way you did, Pete, with your mother, Mary Claire Gubbins, and Shelton Davis, your father, who was a noted anthropologist and a great champion of indigenous tribal rights, such as in the Amazon, where are these people going to come from? Are they going to come from our elementary schools, our high schools, our colleges, our extracurricular activities? What are the cultural conditions to take people at an early age when they're going to decide what vector in life they're going to pursue? Where is this yeast going to come from?
This is a part I learned from you, Ralph, which is that, people think there's all these clever silver bullet activities of how to, solve all the problems. But really, in the end, we need more citizens, basically more agents. We need to get to that 1% of people in different institutions or cities or the country as a whole that are the ones that, that critical mass of people that can move something. So how do we do it? I talk about, this book is kind of aimed at you as an individual mostly, and trying to turn you on to be like the reader on to be a long haul hero. But I do talk a bit about some of the cultural conditions of this. So one is, we need in our education system, I talk about 4 different places where you can get attached to things. One is the idea of craft, which is bringing back the teachers that are not just marching you through a syllabus of units that are all disconnected from each other, but the types of teachers that actually deepen your relationship with an expertise. And, there's the classic examples of craft like woodshop or your soccer coach. But, I feel like when I worked at your office, Ralph, it was a form of craft as well. It was like, here's how to sharpen the tools of civic action. And we need more teachers and mentors that are willing to engage people in craft. That's where you learn a lot of lessons. A second is teams. That's a place where you learn about how to work with other people, where you learn some of these virtues beyond just kind of technical education. You also learn about loyalty and fidelity and doggedness. A third is elders, having more older people reaching out to younger people and saying, let's deepen relationships so that we're not only just learning from the blind leading the blind of peers just leading each other. We need elders being willing to build relationships with younger people, to show them about this history, to show them about what it's like at the other end of a long haul. What are the lessons you've learned? And the most important cultural one that I think everyone could do is to reignite a culture of heroes and heroism. I think there is a push against this today because people don't want to believe in the great man and woman theory of history, the idea that one person can change the world. And, it's fair. We have to learn about the structural factors and economic factors that lead to changing the world. But as an individual, as a human who's just living in our lives, it doesn't guide us to hear that, oh, this revolution only happened because of the economy, or this revolution only happened because of cultural conditions. You need to hear who were the people that fought for this. You need to read biographies of that. You need to have awards ceremonies and halls of fame. You need to have more portraits lining the hallways and people talking about who are those people and what did they achieve and why are we holding them up. My town did a great example of this. They did a women's history walk this past weekend where it killed so many birds with one stone because they put up signs all around the town and gave out maps of doing the self-guided walk. And each of the sign had a woman in Falls Church, Virginia's history who contributed to making our community the way it was from the 1700s to today. And you'd walk around the town learning about these people. And as I was walking, I kept thinking, and they really encourage students to go on this history walk. I kept thinking, oh, wow, I'm seeing the story of someone who worked for 20 years to set up this specific way we did the international baccalaureate system in our school system. Oh, here's the person who's the reason we have this park in this town. Here's the person that's the reason we have a farmer's market. And it makes you think, how can I do that too? And we need that presence of long haul heroes in the daily life of our kids' lives.
I was just going to add to your progenitors of encouraging young people to commitment, neighbors encouraging neighbors. And you just gave an example. And I'm not going to be able to talk about one of your finest examples, Karen Washington, in New York City who started the Garden of Happiness. But there is an example of neighbors invigorating neighbors instead of not even knowing who their neighbors are in an atomized society. We're out of time, unfortunately. We've been talking with Pete Davis, the author of the brand new book dedicated, The Case for Commitment in Age of Infinite Browsing. On the back jacket, he has some pretty impressive people praising this book. Robert Putnam of Harvard, Drew Gilpin Faust, the former president of Harvard. Cornel West calls it a magisterial book on the moral counterculture of commitment and our shallow culture of money and fear. His depth of wisdom and scope of knowledge are astonishing, and his powerful vision of decency and democracy is compelling. End quote. Well, good luck on talking about this book on media throughout the country and maybe throughout the world. Thank you very much, Pete Davis.
Thank you, Ralph. I learned so much of this spirit from you, and you are such a grand exemplar of a long haul hero.
You're so generous. Thank you.
We've been speaking with Pete Davis. We will link to Dedicated at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Stephen Mufson and Pete Davis. For those listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph Nader's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. To support Whirlwind Wheelchair, visit whirlwindwheelchair.org. They do great work showing people in the United States and around the world how to build sturdy, economical wheelchairs from local materials. It's whirlwindwheelchair.org. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
And thank you, everybody. If you're feeling charitable to result-oriented groups, Whirlwind Wheelchair is a prime potential beneficiary for your contributions. You go to their website, you'll see what I mean. They really produce all over the world, teaching people using local materials how to build sturdy, safe wheelchairs.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up. First, Steve and David have some questions for Stephen Mufson.
Steve, we're almost out of time, but we always like to have Steve Scorvan and David Feldman pitch in here.
Yeah, Steve, I don't know if this is really a question. It's more of a comment over this fascinating conversation the two of you are having. And it seems like we have this fascination with technology that will save us. I mean, Ralph alluded to it in the nuclear realm, even in the medical realm, where we as human beings would rather take a pill or have surgery than change our lifestyle. And it seems like we have this belief that technology will save us so we don't have to change our behavior. I don't know, in your writings, in your interviews, have you thought about that? Has that occurred to you as you talk to these people?
Yeah, I think that, for an individual to take action is sometimes challenging because it feels like the problem is so big that you can't make a difference. And I think that's where the growth in organizations and movements can help get you over that hurdle. One of the interesting things in that same survey I mentioned was the astonishing number of young people who had taken part in some sort of climate action already. These are people between the ages of 18 and 30. I think it was 1 out of 8 of them had taken part in some sort of climate action. And that's, I think, a remarkable number. And I don't know how it would compare to some of the movements in the 60s, but I think it says a lot about where this is all going. And I think that it'll help get us over that hurdle of feeling like, one person can't make a difference.
By climate action, you mean demonstrations, marches, testimony. Is that what you mean?
Yes. School strikes, that sort of thing.
Like Greta Thunberg. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. David?
Thank you for this. Is there any magic bullet out there that seems potentially a breakthrough as to cleaning the air? I mean, I've heard these crazy talks of like blimps that filter the air. Is there anything out there that looks promising, or is just a pipe dream?
Yeah, what we call geoengineering. And there are a lot of people out there working on this. And there are a lot of people out there trying to get a handle on rules that should govern this because it's dangerous to fiddle around with the climate like that. These are the kinds of things that people are talking about is a little bit similar to cloud seeding, but it's spread particles in the air and they reflect more of the light back out of the atmosphere. So there are people who are working on that, but it's a dicey thing to do. The
Cloud
other
seeding
scary
doesn't
thing,
work, does it? There's no proof that cloud seeding actually creates rain, but people do it anyway.
right. So I think that the other reason people are nervous about this is that a lot of these techniques aren't particularly high tech. So all you need is maybe an airplane and some particles that you're going to spread. So I think that the consequences are unpredictable and potentially scary. So I think there's a lot of effort to try to get a handle on this before it slips out on its own.
Which is really the argument for massive emphasis on all kinds of prevention, preventing waste of energy, preventing bad technologies from being reproduced and manufactured instead of being replaced by more fuel efficient energy systems.
I was going to say that's one reason, President Trump tried to roll back some of these regulations that would make new equipment more efficient. And the Biden administration is going to put those standards back.
That's right. The EPA just recently has rolled back a number of Trump's pollution affirmation dismantling of the regulatory process. You're right there, and we're looking forward to more of that.
And now we continue our conversation with Pete Davis about the case for long-haul commitment.
Your book is full of examples like this, and that's what's so encouraging about it. It's historical examples, contemporary examples, interviews that Pete Davis conducted. Before I get to the chapter, Open Options Morality, Indifference versus Honor, Pete, tell our listeners how they can get your bicentennial crisis in Harvard Law School, because this is not just inside law school proposal by Pete. This affects what lawyers are going to do for you, against you, of you, by you. It affects the whole sense of fairness in a society, the way these law schools behave and misbehave in their educational priorities. How can people access your report?
If you go to hlsreport.org, you can download the entire PDF of the report. And also, it is available as an ebook on Apple Books, Google Books, and it's available as a print copy on print to order off of, ironically, Amazon. And so there are many ways you can get it at hlsreport.org or find it as an ebook on ebook readers or get a print copy on Amazon. And it's all there. For the print copy, it costs a bit, but the ebook are as cheap as I could make them. And then the downloadable PDF is free at hlsreport.org. And it is, I've had people write to me about that report who didn't go to Harvard in the law and people in other professions who said that there was a lot of lessons about reviving a spirit of public interest professionalism in general out of that report. So hope it is useful.
Well, you're about to experience this. Your book just came out. Dedication. We're talking with Pete Davis, Simon & Schuster, a big publisher with a lot of connections. And pretty soon, the books of some of the Trumpsters are coming out, like Kellyanne Conway and others. And these books, shall we say, with due proportionality, are going to be full of false statements and claims. Her famous phrase, alternative facts. They're going to get front page treatment. They're going to get on the national TV shows. They're going to get reviewed. Meanwhile, books like yours come out. They're very much empirical. They're real. They talk about justice, injustice. They motivate people to higher ideals. They bring the best out of people. Unfortunately, even places like the New York Times and Washington Post don't see fit to review them. I have a lot of examples of that over the years. So we'll see how this book is treated. It's not going to be promoted for lack of energy. You're going to be all over the place giving interviews. The question is whether you'll get into the mass media. We're running short on time, Pete. Can Steve and David pitch in here?
Pete, I can relate to this in a lot of ways. Especially my wife is a vegan, and we would go to restaurants, and usually meant she had maybe one or two choices on the menu. And now we're out here in LA, and there's a lot of vegan restaurants, and they have large menus, and it's actually not all that pleasurable for her because there are just too many choices.
Yeah, I talk about this for, Ralph and I were getting into the grand kind of cultural aspect of this, but the book starts with actually the just basic psychological experience of too many options. The great psychologist on this is Barry Schwartz, who's actually a kind of a deviously radical message, which is, he wrote this great book, The Paradox of Choice, that I quote from, that says, all these psych studies that prove out when you have more options, you're actually less satisfied with the eventual option you choose. When you have 31 flavors at Baskin Robbins, you're actually less satisfied with the eventual ice cream you pick than if you were just said chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry, because you're haunted by the other things you could have picked. And this book kind of unspools from that initial psychological idea to all the huge implications of that experience of, remaining on the menu without ever diving into something.
Too many choices is a controlling process by corporate sellers these days. If they confront you with too many choices for your mortgage, too many choices for your insurance, too many choices for buying a mattress, what happens is that you become cognitive dissonant and you surrender. And you say, well, I don't know how to choose. You tell me. And you basically surrender to the vendor. So it becomes not something that is viewed in consumer theory as a better way of competing. It becomes a controlling process.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Ralph. I'm sorry, Pete. I just want to jump in here with my lack of expertise. But in the entertainment industry, I mentioned Netflix before. And I have some people who have some shows on Netflix. And what they've told me is that Netflix is interested in building the biggest video store in the world. In other words, more choices, having more shows than rather having shows that are on for a long time. So usually what would happen is a show, if it was successful, it would have, 100 episodes. But they're not interested in that anymore. It's more like 13 episodes, and then let's go on to the next thing.
Isn't Apple's success because they didn't give you choice?
Yeah, people, we see this in different examples, where sometimes people they want to save their choices for more important questions. And so that's why some people are more into Apple computers than the, Google or Microsoft that give you 100 different ways of doing it. But I think one of the bigger ideas in this Netflix example, like, here's 10,000 pieces of content. So you're going to find the exact one that fits your perfect subculture. There's a lot of writing on this back in the 80s and 90s about how corporations want to create this set of subcultures so that they can segment everyone and sell more within each subculture. And what the internet has allowed us to do is create subcultures so that you have the exact thing that is only for you. And that's what Netflix is moving towards. Here's a show targeted exactly to you. But the deeper joy of media is, and this is the deeper joy of everything, is experiencing things with other people. And, I guarantee on this goofy example of just shows, the people who watched Cheers, but were able to talk about it with 50 million other people, even though it wasn't the perfect show for them, probably enjoyed that whole collective experience more than someone who lonely in their house watches, the perfect thing just for them. And that's on just media entertainment. But this is the big thing with causes too. We need a lot of people we need a huge, giant movement fighting against climate change. We need a huge, giant movement fighting against corporate power, fighting for social welfare state. And that is going to require, there might be different tendencies inside of them. There might be different ways that chapters that allow it to kind of have different groups that are more closer than the whole movement itself. You don't want a totally bland, totally unified movement, but you need some part of us willing to subsume ourselves into something that's not exactly perfect for us, that has the messiness of interacting with other people if we want to get anything collectively done. And that is part of the spirit of this book too, which is you can't just have it be, you can't have consumer life as picking off of a menu to find the perfect thing for you. Civic life is coming together with people who are sometimes different than you to achieve things together. And commitment's part of that. And I have a whole chapter in the book on the fear of association, the fear of how joining up with something will implicate your perfect identity, your reputation. But we need to overcome that to have any of the joys or the impact of community.
And finally, Ralph answers some listener questions.
David, let's do some listener questions.
Okay, this is from Wolfarth, and it's about the fairness doctrine. Ralph, I live just outside Toledo, Ohio. Toledo is a blue city with a long history of United Auto Worker factory employment. All of its small privately owned radio stations were bought up by iHeartMedia and Cumulus Media. The only talk radio station, WSPD 1370, has changed from a news station to a right-wing propaganda outlet. The daily schedule is filled with Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, and others. I guess no longer Rush Limbaugh. The morning local host routinely spreads misinformation that is uncontested. I did battle this station about 15 years ago after the hosts began hanging up or potting over me when I called to correct them on their lies. I ended up commenting on them on social media, pointing out their outrageous lies. The station retaliated by blocking me from being able to comment on their internet sites. They even made radio commercials about me to vilify me in public. A local weekly ran a story on my battle with the radio station. For a while, most Democratic local politicians avoided the station, but as time has passed, it seems these same politicians have accepted this as the new normal, forgetting our Democratic past. Just this week, the host, Fred Lefevre, stated that workers are no safer working under a union contract as non-union workers. This is a bald-faced lie. As we all know, unions created, through lobbying, government agencies to protect worker safety. You're right to say current workers have been brainwashed by this right-wing concentration of our radio stations. 1/3 of my United Auto Worker brothers voted for Donald Trump in 2016. It's truly a sad state of affairs.
And it's truly a description of the situation in radio in a lot of towns and cities around the country. Fortunately, in Toledo, there is a vibrant NPR station that can still provide more accurate news and fair commentary for people in the Toledo area. Thanks for all this detail, Wolfarth.
Didn't the United Auto Workers have a radio network a few decades ago?
There used to be a national radio station syndicated called The Voice of Labor, and it was widely listened to. And it was at its peak in the 1940s and early 1950s. And here we are, half a century or more later, and organized labor has no radio stations, no TV stations. The newspapers that used to be called the labor newspapers are dwindling or closed down. The UAW still has a newsletter. The machinists still have newsletters. But the labor press, which I wrote about years ago in the Progressive magazine out of Madison, Wisconsin, is at its lowest point in history.
You would think with all the money that unions have in pensions that they turn over to hedge funds and money managers, they would keep some of that to invest in the future by buying up a couple of radio stations.
Good point. And that's why 1/3 of all union members voted for George W. Bush and Donald Trump. 1/3. Because the labor leaders from the AFL-CIO on down are not connecting. I mean, forget about addressing large rallies of workers in the old days in front of factories. They're not connecting. They've got an email system, and they send out emails. That's their definition of education and organizing these days, with few exceptions. Very sad.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak with activist Winona LaDuke and filmmaker Michael Henning about the miracle of industrial hemp. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way